The glass was always the first thing I noticed. Every morning, walking into my office on the 54th floor, the world was framed by a seamless wall of it. It wasn't just a window, it was a statement. It separated me from the noise, the chaos, the sprawling city below that looked like a complex circuit board, its millions of lives just tiny pulses of light and energy that I, from my silent perch, helped to direct. The silence was the second thing. It was a manufactured silence, a testament to expensive engineering and the sheer altitude. Down there, horns blared, sirens wailed, and people shouted. Up here, the only sound was the discreet hum of the climate control and the soft, almost imperceptible click of my pen on a contract. This was the sound of power. For 15 years, this office had been my sanctuary, my command center, my cage. I had built this company, not from the ground up, but from a respectable mid-tier firm into a global behemoth. My days were a meticulously choreographed ballet of efficiency. They started before the sun rose, with a glance at the Asian markets, and ended long after it set, with a final call to London. My life was a series of meetings, negotiations, and strategic decisions that moved millions of dollars and affected thousands of lives. I was the master of this universe, the architect of its success. My schedule was a fortress, guarded by a team of assistants who managed every minute of my existence. I knew the flight schedules to Zurich better than I knew my son's soccer schedule. I could recall the fine print of a merger agreement from 3 years ago, but I couldn't remember the last time I had a real conversation with my wife that wasn't about logistics or household expenses. My family existed in the margins of my calendar. A quick breakfast where I'd scan the financial news on my tablet while they talked about school or friends. A fleeting kiss on the cheek before I disappeared into the chauffeured car, my mind already on the day's first conference call. I saw their lives through the photos my wife would send me. My daughter's first ballet recital, my son's winning goal, family holidays I missed because of a critical deal. I told myself it was all for them. The sprawling house in the suburbs, the private schools, the designer clothes, the sense of security that a 9-figure net worth provided. I was providing a world of opportunity, a life without limits. I thought that was what a father and a husband did. I was the provider, the protector. It was a simple, clear role, much like my role as CEO. You focus on the bottom line, you deliver results, and everything else falls into place. The company's stocks were a reflection of my worth, a daily report card on my performance as a man. I watched them with a hawk's intensity, celebrating every tick upwards, feeling every dip as a personal failure. My personal portfolio was an extension of this, a carefully curated collection of investments designed for aggressive growth. I loved the game, the intellectual challenge of predicting the market's whims, of outsmarting the invisible hand. My deputy was my right-hand man, my shadow. He had been with me for a decade, a brilliant, tireless operator who understood my vision and executed it flawlessly. He handled the day-to-day operations, the nitty-gritty details that I no longer had the time or patience for. I trusted him implicitly. He was the one who first brought me the new diversification strategy. It was bold, leaning heavily into high-risk, high-reward emerging tech startups and some experimental ventures with cryptocurrencies. It was a departure from our more conservative approach, but the potential returns were staggering. I remember him spreading the projections across my vast mahogany desk. "This," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with ambition, "is how we future-proof the company. This is our legacy." I was seduced by the sheer scale of it, the audacity. It appealed to the part of me that had always been a gambler, the part that got me to this office in the first place. I preached risk management in every shareholder meeting, a comforting mantra for the board, but true growth, the kind that makes legends, always involves a leap of faith. I approved the plan. I signed the papers without reading every line. That was his job. I was the visionary, he was the technician. The initial results were phenomenal. Our income surged, the stock price hit an all-time high, and Wall Street lauded me as a genius. I felt invincible. During this time, the distance at home grew into a chasm. My wife tried to bridge it at first. She'd planned special dinners that I would cancel at the last minute. She'd ask about my day, and I'd give her a curt summary of market fluctuations and corporate politics. The language of my world was alien to her, and I had forgotten how to speak hers. The silence between us grew heavier than the silence in my office. It was a silence filled with unspoken resentments and quiet disappointments. The kids stopped trying to show me their drawings or tell me about their day. They saw me as a figure who passed through the house, a source of funds, not a source of comfort or guidance. I noticed it in fleeting moments of clarity, usually late at night, staring at the ceiling, the adrenaline of the day wearing off, leaving a hollow ache in its place. But then the morning would come, and the pull of the 54th floor, the allure of the game, would erase everything else. I had a duty, a responsibility to the company, to the shareholders. My family, I reasoned, was secure. They had the best of everything. My presence was a luxury, not a necessity. The first tremor was an email. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an innocuous subject line from our chief financial officer. Query from the auditors. It was routine, a normal part of the quarterly review process. I almost delegated it to my deputy, but something made me open it myself. It was a simple question about a series of wire transfers to an offshore holding company I didn't recognize. The amounts were substantial, but not astronomical in the grand scheme of our operations. I forwarded it to my deputy with a one-line instruction, "Please clarify." His response was immediate and reassuring. "A formality, boss, part of the new tech investment vehicle, all accounted for, I'll handle it." I didn't think about it again. I had a flight to Tokyo to catch. I was focused on the horizon, on the next big deal, the next victory. I didn't see the crack that had just appeared at my feet, the first tiny fracture in the glass wall of my perfectly constructed world. The ground was shifting, but from 54 floors up, you don't feel the tremors until the whole building starts to sway. And by then, it's already too late. I was standing on top of a mountain, but the mountain was hollow, and the silent collapse had already begun from within. The return from Tokyo felt different. Usually, I'd step off the plane buzzing with a sense of accomplishment, my mind already 5 steps ahead, planning the integration of the new acquisition. This time, a strange sense of unease settled over me like the damp city air. The auditor's query, which I had dismissed so easily, lingered in the back of my mind. It was a loose thread in an otherwise perfectly tailored suit, and I couldn't resist the urge to pull at it. The office atmosphere had changed. The usual deference in my employees' eyes was replaced with something I couldn't quite decipher: curiosity, perhaps a hint of fear. The auditors were no longer just a name in an email. They were a physical presence, a team of grim-faced accountants occupying a conference room on the 48th floor. They had requested access to a staggering amount of data, going back years. My deputy assured me it was a deep-dive audit, a new, more thorough procedure that was becoming industry standard. "Nothing to worry about," he said, his smile as polished and reassuring as ever. "We're an open book." But his eyes didn't quite meet mine. He was suddenly busier than usual, always rushing to a meeting, his phone perpetually pressed to his ear. I tried to corner him for a detailed briefing on the auditor's progress, but he was evasive, promising to schedule a full rundown that never materialized. The cracks started to multiply. The CFO requested a private meeting, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he laid a file on my desk. It contained a list of transactions, dozens of them, all funneling money into shell corporations with opaque ownership structures. The total was staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars, and every single transaction had been authorized under a special discretionary fund I had approved, a fund managed exclusively by my deputy. "The documentation is perfect," the CFO whispered, as if the walls themselves were listening. "Too perfect, every I dotted, every T crossed, but the money, it just vanishes." I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a sophisticated, deliberate deception. I had been so focused on the grand strategy, on the view from the summit, that I had never bothered to inspect the foundations. I had delegated the most vital element of my entire operation: trust. The investigation escalated. It was no longer an internal audit. The SEC was notified. The words "financial machinations" began to be whispered in the hallways. My name, my reputation, was inextricably linked to the unfolding disaster. The company's stock, my personal report card, began a precipitous slide. Each downward point was a physical blow, a piece of my identity being stripped away. The news broke on a Wednesday. A headline in a major financial journal: "Investigation into accounting irregularities at Titan Corp." My face was on the screen, a stern corporate photo taken in a moment of triumph, now used as the face of a brewing scandal. The calls started, a deluge of them. Board members, investors, reporters. My carefully managed world descended into chaos. The fortress of my schedule was breached, and the silence of my office was shattered. But the worst silence was at home. When I walked through the door that evening, the house was eerily quiet. My wife was sitting in the dark, the television off, her face illuminated only by the cold blue light of her phone. She didn't need to ask, she already knew. The look in her eyes was not one of anger, but of a deep, weary disappointment. It was the look of someone whose worst fears had just been confirmed. "I always knew you were reckless," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You were always gambling. With the market, with your time with us. I just never thought you'd lose." Our arguments had always been about my absence. Now they were about my very presence, the disgrace I had brought into our home. The carefully constructed life of privilege and security was a house of cards in a hurricane. We had a massive credit line secured against our portfolio, a portfolio that was now evaporating. Our lavish lifestyle was built on a foundation of debt and assumption, the assumption that the numbers would always go up. My son refused to go to school, ashamed of the whispers he knew would follow him. My daughter cried in her room, scared and confused, sensing the terror that had gripped her parents. I was a stranger to them in the best of times. Now I was a monster, the man who had broken their world. My deputy had vanished. His phone went straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty. He had taken a medical leave of absence 2 days before the story broke. He was a ghost, and I was left to face the inferno alone. The board meeting was a public execution. I sat at the head of the vast table where I had reigned for years, and I felt like a prisoner in the dock. The men who had once hung on my every word now looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. Their lawyers did most of the talking. The evidence was overwhelming. While the fraud was orchestrated by my deputy, the legal doctrine of command responsibility made me culpable. My signature was on the documents that enabled the scheme. My gross negligence was the key that had unlocked the vault. They gave me a choice, a stark, brutal choice. I could fight. I could drag the company through a years-long legal battle, a public spectacle that would likely destroy what was left of its reputation and cost thousands of people their jobs. Or I could take the fall. I could be the villain. I could offer a clean, swift end to the crisis. I would have to resign immediately, issue a public statement accepting full responsibility, and forfeit my entire severance package and all my vested stock options. It would save the company, they argued. It would be my final act as a leader, a sacrifice for the greater good. It was a perfectly constructed trap. They were offering me a chance to salvage a sliver of my honor by publicly immolating myself. I thought about the thousands of employees, the people with mortgages and families who depended on this company. I thought about my own family, the shame I had already caused them. A protracted fight would only prolong their agony. In the end, the decision was simple. My entire life had been about making the tough call for the good of the corporation. This was just the last and most personal of those calls. I agreed to their terms. I walked out of that boardroom and into the elevator. The ride down from the 54th floor was the longest journey of my life. Each floor we passed was a year of my life, a piece of my ambition, a layer of my identity being shed. When the doors opened to the lobby, I wasn't a CEO anymore. I was just a man in an expensive suit, walking out into a world that no longer wanted him. The statement was released an hour later. My career, my life's work, was reduced to a single, damning paragraph. The collapse was no longer silent. It was a deafening roar that echoed across the globe, and I was standing at its epicenter, buried in the rubble. The days that followed my resignation were a blur of beige rooms and muted voices. Lawyers, offices, mediation sessions, depositions. The world I had once commanded from a glass tower was now reduced to the claustrophobic confines of conference rooms that all smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. My life was no longer my own. It was a legal case, a file number, a series of liabilities to be managed. The financial cost was immediate and catastrophic. My assets were frozen. The vast personal investments I had so carefully cultivated were now being liquidated at a fraction of their value to cover legal fees and preliminary settlements. The word debt, which for years had been an abstract concept I used to leverage corporate acquisitions, became a suffocating reality. It was a number that grew larger every day, a hungry beast devouring the remnants of my former life. We had to sell the house. The sprawling estate that was meant to be a symbol of my success, a fortress for my family, became just another asset on a ledger. Movers, strangers with impassive faces, came and packed up our lives into cardboard boxes. I watched as my wife sorted through our belongings, her face a mask of grim efficiency. She divided everything into 2 piles, hers and to be sold. There was no ours anymore. The sale of the house barely made a dent in the mountain of debt. Next went the cars, the art, the watches. Each sold item was a piece of my old identity being stripped away, leaving me raw and exposed. The public humiliation was relentless. My face was a fixture on financial news channels, the villain in a cautionary tale about corporate greed and hubris. I stopped leaving the small, rented apartment we had moved into. The shame was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe to face the world. The final blow, the one that shattered what little was left of me, came not from a lawyer or a reporter, but from my wife. It happened on a Tuesday, a day just like any other in my new, featureless existence. She sat me down at the cheap kitchen table that wobbled on the uneven floor. There were no tears, no raised voices. Her exhaustion was too deep for that. She told me she was leaving and she was taking the children. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat. "I can't live with the shame, the fear. The kids deserve a chance at a normal life away from all of this." She wasn't just leaving the man who had lost a fortune. She was leaving the man who had been a ghost in her life for 15 years. The financial collapse wasn't the cause of our divorce. It was just the catalyst, the event that made the years of emotional bankruptcy impossible to ignore any longer. I didn't fight her. I had no fight left. I had no right to ask her to stay, to tether her to my sinking ship. I watched her pack. I watched my children, their faces etched with a confusion and sadness I couldn't soothe, get into her car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched them drive away until the red taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving me in a silence that was absolute and crushing. The emptiness of the apartment was a living thing. For weeks, I barely moved. I lived on coffee and toast. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't open the mail. The world outside ceased to exist. My past was a ruin, my future a void. I was unemployable, a pariah in the only world I had ever known. The name that had once opened any door was now a red flag on any application. I thought about the irony of it all. I had managed a global corporation with a complex annual budget of billions, and now I couldn't even figure out how to manage my own survival. I was a master of the universe who had lost his universe. I had one thing left, a final, forgotten asset, a small, dilapidated house in a rural town a few hundred miles away. It had belonged to my father, a man I barely knew. He was a carpenter, a quiet man who had died when I was in college, already on my relentless climb up the corporate ladder. I had never even visited the house, had only kept paying the property taxes out of a vague, unexamined sense of duty. It was a loose end, and now it was my only lifeline. I sold the last of my possessions, a pair of expensive cufflinks, to pay for gas and a few boxes of groceries. I packed what was left of my life, a few clothes, some books, a single photograph of my children, into my aging sedan, and I drove. I drove away from the city, from the ghosts of my past, from the towering buildings that now seemed to mock me. The journey was a long, silent penance. As the skyscrapers gave way to suburbs and suburbs to farmland, I felt the crushing weight on my chest begin to lighten just a fraction. I arrived at the house at dusk. It was even smaller and more neglected than I had imagined. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the garden was a wild, overgrown tangle of weeds and thorns. It was a perfect reflection of my own life, a dilapidated structure choked by years of neglect. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and disuse. The furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts in the fading light. This wasn't just a house. It was a time capsule, a museum of a life I had never bothered to understand. My father's life. I walked through the silent rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. In the corner of what must have been his workshop, I saw them. A collection of old, hand-worn tools hanging neatly on a pegboard. A saw, a hammer, a set of wood chisels. They were simple, functional objects, tools meant for creating, not for commanding. I reached out and ran my hand over the smooth, worn wood of a shovel handle. My hands were soft, manicured, the hands of a man who had only ever lifted a pen or a phone. This handle was rough, solid, real. I stood there in the dusty silence of my father's house, a broken man with nothing to his name. I looked out the dirty window at the chaotic wilderness of the garden. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about the stock market or legal motions or what the world thought of me. I was faced with a simple, tangible problem, the weeds, the chaos, the decay, and in my hand I held a simple, tangible solution. I took the shovel off the wall, the weight of it unfamiliar but strangely comforting. I walked outside, the cool evening air on my face, and I took the first dig into the hard, unforgiving earth. The sound of the metal blade slicing into the soil was the first real, productive sound I had made in a very long time. It was a beginning. The first few weeks were a painful education. My body, accustomed to leather chairs and climate-controlled environments, rebelled against the unaccustomed labor. My back ached, my hands blistered, and every muscle screamed in protest. But I kept going. I rose with the sun and worked until my body forced me to stop. Clearing the garden was a battle, a slow, methodical war against years of neglect. I tore out thorny bushes, pulled up stubborn weeds, and cut back the overgrown branches that blocked the light. Each cleared patch of soil felt like a monumental victory, a small piece of order reclaimed from chaos. The physical exhaustion was a blessing. It silenced the relentless chatter in my mind, the endless loop of regret and what-ifs. When I was wrestling with a thick tree root, I wasn't thinking about my lost fortune or my ruined reputation. I was thinking only about leverage and force. When I finally collapsed into bed at night, my sleep was a deep, dreamless void, a mercy I hadn't known in years. As I worked on the land, I began to work on the house. I learned to patch a roof, to replace a broken window pane, to strip old paint and apply a fresh coat. I found my father's old notebooks in the workshop, filled with his elegant, precise handwriting, detailing carpentry projects, sketching designs for furniture, noting the best times to plant certain vegetables. I was learning about him through the legacy of his hands, understanding a man who communicated not with memos and directives, but with wood and soil. He had built this life himself, a life of quiet satisfaction that I, in my arrogance, had dismissed as small and unimportant. I realized my own life had been an elaborate performance. The CEO, the titan of industry, it was a role I played, a costume I wore. I had become so consumed by the performance that I had forgotten the man underneath. Here, covered in dirt and sweat, with no one to impress, I was simply myself. The work was honest. It didn't offer stock options or bonuses. Its rewards were simpler: a straight fence, a weed-free garden bed, a roof that didn't leak. My income was non-existent, but for the first time I felt a sense of genuine wealth. I started a small vegetable garden. I planted tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce. I watched with a sense of wonder as the first green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth. It felt like a miracle. I was creating life, nurturing it. This was a different kind of investment, one with a guaranteed return of sustenance and simple beauty. I began to reconnect with my children. The first call was the hardest thing I'd ever done. My voice trembled as I spoke to my daughter. I didn't make excuses or false promises. I just told her I was sorry and that I missed her. I told her about the house, about her grandfather's garden. At first, the calls were short and awkward, but I kept calling. I sent them photos of the garden, of a bird's nest I'd found, of a wobbly but functional chair I had built. One weekend, they came to visit. My ex-wife dropped them off, a brief civil exchange at the end of the driveway. The children were hesitant at first, seeing me in old work clothes, my hands stained with earth. This wasn't the powerful, untouchable father they knew. But as I showed them how to plant a seed, as we worked together to build a small treehouse in an old oak, the walls began to come down. We didn't talk about the collapse, about the money, about the divorce. We talked about a shared project. We laughed when I hammered my thumb. We ate simple sandwiches sitting on the porch I had just repaired. I wasn't buying their affection with expensive toys or lavish holidays. I was earning it with my time, with my presence. It was the most important work I had ever done. As the seasons turned, a new life began to take shape. I sold my vegetables at the local farmer's market. The money was a pittance compared to what I once earned in a single minute on the stock market, but holding a few crumpled bills that I had earned with my own two hands felt more real than any wire transfer had. I started doing odd jobs for people in town, fixing a broken gate, building some bookshelves. My father's tools, once foreign objects, now felt like extensions of my own hands. My reputation was no longer that of a disgraced CEO, but of the quiet man who was good with his hands. I had no credit, no debt, no portfolio. My daily budget was simple: earn enough for food, for supplies, for gas. It was a life stripped down to its essentials, and in that simplicity I found a profound sense of freedom. I sometimes think about my old life. The view from the 54th floor, the thrill of the deal, the intoxicating hum of power. I don't miss it. I see now that my silent collapse didn't begin with the auditor's email. It began years earlier, in the quiet, missed moments with my family. The financial ruin was just the loud, violent crash that finally forced me to open my eyes to the wreckage that was already there. I had built an empire of glass and steel, but I had let my own home crumble. I now live in a small, repaired house surrounded by a garden that I brought back to life. My relationship with my children is fragile but growing, a tender new shoot that needs constant care. I don't have a career, I have work. I don't have a massive net worth, I have a life. The other day, my son called me to ask for advice on how to fix his bicycle. It was a simple question, but it was everything. He was asking me to be a father. I had lost an empire, but I was slowly, finally finding myself. It's a different kind of success, a quieter, more durable kind. It's the kind that grows in the earth and is built with your own two hands. Thanks listening this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how global our community is. Comment your country down below. Share this story to your friends and leave a like and subscribe for more episodes like this.